From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 15. Fraenk could see there was a very good reason this rangy old crow had diverted him into the shadowy alcove. Peering out, he could see the hell-touched man was tall, slender, and downright intimidating. His black hair was oily and hung to his shoulders in uneven trusses. He was wearing the same light grey overcloak Fraenk had seen him with days ago on the street. Under was a much older set of robes, black, worn fabric with arcane lettering stitched down the front. It reminded Fraenk of something he'd seen somewhere or read in a scroll, but in this chilling moment he could not remember. Fraenk pressed back against the stone wall, hoping the hard shadows of the sunny day concealed him. The entrance where he found himself was to a roofless building that had been abandoned some time ago. There were several others like it in this part of the district. If he had to hazard a guess why, Fraenk would have surmised that its close proximity to the plague house, or possibly the Fernbrook's fickle taxation schemes, caused the owner to leave. For whatever reason, Fraenk was all alone out here with just an old crow to support him. It occurred to Fraenk that this noisy menace had, as of very recently, been sounding an entire cacophony of bird noise. One more of those would give away his location entirely. But the bird just tilted its head and blinked with its good eye, nearly invisible in the shadow. The hell-touched man moved at a brisk pace that seemed to suggest he had a destination in mind. Fraenk knew this was good. He would probably not be veering off for a wandering tour of the local ruins. If Fraenk and his ancient avian accomplice could keep inaudible and avoid alerting their assailant, they'd avert an accosting. They waited, breath held as the Dark One nearly passed them, not noticing his onlookers. Fraenk was almost ready to move when something strange happened. The hell-touched recoiled as if someone behind him loudly shouted his name. His hand flew up to his neck, and he turned. Fraenk saw he was gripping an ornate metal collar with a brilliant emerald jewel inset that rippled the air around it. The hell-touched man swiveled his head, scanning the ruined buildings with his intense orange eyes. He didn't seem to see Fraenk yet, but something was nudging him ever closer. Fraenk froze. Maybe he could still stay hidden and hope that the demon blood moved on. The hell-touched raised both hands in a fluid motion, his fingers tracing and articulating a specific order of gestures. His mouth moved, forming some arcane ecclesiastic. Dark purple energy suddenly gathered to his hands. He was casting a spell, and not the harmless kind that the arcane lords say was lawfully permitted in Arathes. The last thing Fraenk wanted was to fight this out, but his options were quickly diminishing. Taking on a magic user was a tremendously bad idea, but he might be able to catch this fiend off guard if he hit him with a face full of throwing knives before he could react. This was a tactic his combat instructor called a Hahn preemptive offensive. Fight dirty and live seemed a much better maxim. Knights and paladins may pledge to fight with honor on an open field of battle, but he was bound by no such codes. Let the honorable dead heroes have their ballads of remembrance written about them. What good is a song if you won't be alive to hear it? As a trained reflex, Frank's hand slowly lowered to his brace of throwing knives, but found to his vexation that he was still dressed like an unarmed charitable monk and had virtually none of his typical arch-preceptor's accoutrements. The only weapon he really had was a long dagger strapped to his leg, which he couldn't easily reach. For all of the hearty back-patting he was doing earlier about his perfect disguise, Fraenk now discovered its major drawback. Next time he vowed to pose as an armoured crossbowman, maybe a guard captain with a contingent of heavy knights and a battle mage, if there was a next time. Fraenk had the giddy, ridiculous thought that they could perhaps just talk this disagreement over instead. Hell-touched were just people, after all, albeit with an excessive amount of demon blood which gave them a higher predilection towards evil. At least, that's what his research in Arathes' great library had said. The hell-touched man was steadily and cautiously advancing in his direction. Dangerous energy crackled from the spell on his fingers. He was ready for something to jump out. There was no escape, and he couldn't hide much longer. Fraenk decided he might as well step out and reveal himself. Just as Fraenk shifted his foot, the crow burst into flight in a commotion of feathers and squawks. The bird shot right for him like a black dart. Instinctively, the hell-touched crossed his hands at the wrists, sending a blazing dome of energy over him in a brilliant flare of interlocking symbols. When the crow hit the barrier, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the area, sending a faint whoosh of air that wobbled loose stones in their masonry, releasing cascades of thin granules and dust. The bird vectored in a new angle off the shield, flapping furiously to correct its course, and already the hell-touched man was turning to follow its path with his gaze. He was chanting in some guttural tongue, very different from the earlier spell he cast. The hell-touched man pulled a leather pouch off his belt and began pouring out what looked like black sand onto the street in a fist-sized circle. The crow was still fluttering away fast, getting smaller in the sky as the man pulled an acid-etched dagger from his belt and drew it across the back of his arm. Immediately, a line of dark blood runneled out from the cut. He moved his arm over the drawn circle, letting his blood soak the black sand. His utterances grew louder, and something strange began to happen within the radius. The hell-touched man's sand and blood mixture first boiled and then burst into polychromic flames. Immediately, a tainted blast of air erupted skyward. Fraenk could see something inexplicable happening in the area above the flames. It was as if reality itself became thin and translucent, and behind it another realm came into view. But if our world was sunshine and blue skies, this other place was its dark opposite. Even the air that sucked through the hole seemed rank and poisonous. Fraenk wondered what kind of magic could do such a thing, or to what hellish purpose it might serve. Then he watched as something terrible crawled through the opening. Fraenk could see it was black and hairy. It moved awkwardly, trying to reorient itself in its new world. Then it spread leathery bat wings, but this was no bat. It had a bulbous green eye on a swivelling stem. Beneath its body were dozens of whip-like appendages that lashed and writhed continuously. The effect was unpleasant, to say the least. This must have been how the Blackhounds got into the city, Fraenk realized. Immediately after it was through, the hell-touched man kicked the blood circle with his boot, destroying the effect, and the portal immediately vanished. What was left behind was the hellish cyclopean bat thing from the Chaos realm. A Chaos bat. Fraenk decided to call it for expediency. The Chaos bat opened a triangular mouth that had a double row of curving teeth. It locked the hateful green eye first on the hell-touched man, uttered an unholy scream, and then ungratefully flung itself at him in a flailing attack. The man was ready for such a sudden but inevitable betrayal, however, and bounced it off his hands with a smaller shield spell. The Chaos bat seemed neither injured nor perturbed by this, and took off in a new course, toward the escaping crow. Fraenk quickly realized this distraction might be his only opportunity to escape, and he quickly ducked out of the alcove and around the corner where the hell-touched man had just come. He waited, listening for any approaching footsteps. After a moment, the ones he heard were of someone heading further away. Fraenk allowed himself a soft exhale. The bird had saved him. He distantly hoped the crow would be all right, but whatever its fate, it was beyond anything Fraenk could do for it at this point other than tip off the local arcane lord that a loose chaos bat was flapping around the district. As for this magic-wielding hell-touched, Fraenk vowed to deal with him personally. Venantius Dexter was born into a prominent Pelusian family of Sirusol. His father was a brilliant government operator who wrote searing, incisive edicts and powerful proclamations that were the pride of his fellow statesmen and the envy of political enemies. He had an entire cadre of apprentices who studied under him, spending each day under his tutelage waiting for a morsel of his brilliant thoughts. His mother was a singular beauty, a romantic conquest as desirable and unattainable as the tallest mount in the Runsa peaks. This didn't stop the endless stream of potential suitors from calling. In the end, it was his father who she chose herself, after hearing him giving a speech on the topic of what defines beauty while he was in the forum. As legend has it, he had been partway through a carefully reasoned and epistemologically justified discourse that would define exactly what beauty was. But upon seeing her, he stopped and threw down his notes. He called her to the centre of the forum and presented her as his final proof. to the thunderous applause of all present. Shortly thereafter, they were married and produced a son whom they named Dexter, which meant Anointed One. He was the ultimate blend of them both, beauty and brains combined into a single human. He was their pride and joy. They frequently opined that the child was possibly their greatest contribution to the Grand Pelusian Empire. Then, 4 years later, and to their mild annoyance, their second son, Dandrikan, was born. His name translated roughly to, "Oh great, another child." From the moment he was thrust forth into the world, Venantius Dandrikan had to struggle for all he had. His father and mother had not wanted a second child, for differing reasons. She was still upset by the toll that childbearing had taken upon her body, and therefore her desirability for all the various gentlemen callers, who still seemed to show up at their estate when his father was busy lecturing or otherwise distracted with his academic pursuits. His father had already invested his remaining interest in Dexter, so instead of carving out more of his personal time to another child, he had the unique opportunity to instead treat the boy as the subject of one of his thought experiments, one that the local orphanages refused to oblige him with one of their charges. Sir Venantius posited amongst his learned peers that a child who was raised without any of the advantages of an elite station, education, money, or even parental affection, any privilege whatsoever, could still become a productive member within society, provided they were quirted with the proper whip. To the unexpected delight of all observers of this dubious experiment, Dandrikan actually exceeded expectations. His desire to please unapproving parents and strict instructors made him work all the harder, and soon he surpassed his charmed older brother in all areas of education, elocution, and even arms training. Unfortunately, this was a great blow to his father's test. Not for Dandrikan's personal achievements contradicting the hypothesis, but because the lad was overshadowing his clearly superior brother Dexter. Meanwhile, the elder boy was proving to be distastefully entitled, unambitious, and a bit of a dull wit. This was not acceptable. Dandrikan soon found himself shipped off to apprentice at the Wizard Academy in Sarmati. It was a notoriously dangerous and highly selective school that turned out the most elite wielders of magic anywhere in the land. What he didn't know before he arrived was that most students had been training since they were old enough to speak. This disadvantage proved insurmountable, however. Despite his best efforts, Dandrikan could not catch up to even the most mediocre apprentices. He found himself in constant trouble with the teachers and given excessive menial duties which only made him fall further behind. Eventually, Dandrikan was removed from classes and sent down to the storehouse where they kept the mildly cursed and arcane objects. This assignment offered him unique access and deep knowledge for any item imbued with magic. He would remain there for years before one day boldly striking out on his own to share his unique gift with the world, and also taking more than a few of the choicest items with him. Standing now in the very same dealer's illicit backroom shop, Fraenk waited patiently for Dandrikan to finish sharing his difficult and somehow triumphant personal history. How much of it was true? Fraenk guessed very little. It was the third such tale he had heard from the man, and very few of the details overlapped. One theme that did seem to emerge was about how Dandrikan himself was an unsung hero, misunderstood genius, and destined for future greatness, instead of being a sad, bitter, lonely man who was forced to sell his cursed wares in a reeking, plague-ridden house of the dying. Pathetic was often the word added to any mention of his name. Fraenk had fortified himself with a couple of quaffs from his trusty bottle before entering, which helped him tolerate the man, if not the smell. To his credit, though, Dandrikan was a gracious host from the moment Fraenk entered. He lit several sticks of incense and cranked open the ventilation windows, which allowed a refreshing cross breeze to carry the redolent scent of sick out the other end of the building.
Good to see you, Frankie.
Dandrikan beamed finally, after he had finished not only the tale of his impressive pedigree, but also a brief account of his recent travels to Tigrayan for a pickup of some pilfered interroga confiscations.
They are industrious, those dirty interrogers.
Dandrikan continued in a sly tone.
They torture you just the same as look at you. And those doughy-eyed lambs just let them do it too. Line right up with a smile on their dumb face. Ooh, me next, sir.
Dandrikan sighed.
I'll give 'em this much at least. The interrogers do end up with some wicked little trinkets.
In examining him closer, Fraenk supposed that Dandrikan could have been of Pelusian blood. His face was still youthful, possibly even handsome, if he'd bothered to bathe and visit a tailor. Then he would have looked at home in the upper market district, where the fancy elf lordlings spent their day shopping, drinking expensive vintages, and quoting poetry to one another. But Dandrikan seemed content where he was, if a bit starved for attention.
Not all of them are weak, mind you.
He continued puttering over an iron teapot and pouring out 2 steaming cups with a scattering of dry leaves. Dandrikan's ring-adorned fingers clinked cheerfully against the porcelain. He handed one to Fraenk and blew the steam on his own.
Some's got true strength, if you know what I mean.
Fraenk wasn't interested in discussing politics for his own city, let alone another kingdom. Degrain's controversial leader, the tyrant, as he had taken to calling himself, was an endless source of discussion in Arathis and parts beyond. Some thought his strong leadership style was what that divine forsaken land needed to purge the evil from the cursed Tigranian soil. Others argued that Sarmatian forces shouldn't be sent out to die for some despot, even if he was battling another warlord. In some darker sectors still, they quietly believed that the elves should be supporting the upstart Krieg, who had a legitimate right to conquest. But those extremists had all but gone silent after news of his defeat came back to the city. Fraenk hated the endless bickering from folks whose opinions mattered not at all and did his best to avoid the discussions that popped up like random grass fires. So instead of acknowledging the prompt, Fraenk took a sip of the tea, which was surprisingly decent, and then pretended to remember something he secreted in his monk robes. "The tea is good, but care for a little sweetness in yours?" Fraenk pulled the bottle out and whispered a little of the amber liquid into his cup. Dandrikan's eyes lit up.
Oh gods, Fraenk, you always come bearing the good stuff.
Dandrikan made room in his cup and emptied the remainder of Frank's booze into it. He sipped and smiled happily. "You like it? It's my own personal blend. I'll have a bottle sent over to you." Fraenk smiled.
You do that for me?
Dandrikan looked surprised and thrilled. A coy smile played at the corner of his mouth.
You're a good one, Fraenk. If there's anything I can ever do for you...
Nah, I wouldn't press on your kindness, Dan. The way you helped me figure out that it wasn't a cursed corset causing Lord Fairtwin's daughter to...
mount half the squires in his lordship's retinue like they were palfreys.
Dandrikan waggled his eyebrows suggestively. That's a matter he still appreciates your discretion on, at least until he can find her a good match and marry her off.
Well, if he ain't too choosy, I'd propose myself. I do enjoy a randy maiden.
I'll be sure and let him know, Fraenk promised, knowing he would do no such thing. I'm actually here to secure another matter, however, one I'm pleased to pay for.
Ah, another case.
Dandrikan gulped the dregs of his cup and set it aside. He stood and walked behind the wooden counter where he liked to conduct his appraisals. Dandrikan pulled a stained cloth apron he had hanging from a hook on the wall and slipped it on, covering a very old leather belt adorned with strange symbols that looked like clouds. He deftly tied the apron strings behind his back, then unfurled an oddly pristine rectangle of dark blue crushed velvet on top of the counter. His field of battle was ready.
What do you have for me, Frankie?
Well, a little appraisal, if you would. Fraenk stood to join him on the other side. As he reached into the hidden pouch he had bound on a belt, his fingers slipped through the chain loop of the pendant. A bad feeling hit him suddenly. Like it was not only a terrible idea for him to be here, it was worse that he brought the necklace with him. The jewellery itself was fighting him. It did not want to be seen or known. Bad enough that Fraenk was focused on it, but now another? He felt a chill crawl up his fingers and hand, which was actually rather painful. It gave him a pause. Maybe this was more than the effect of the necklace. Perhaps this was his own instincts telling him it was very bad to show anyone else this object. But Fraenk had made it this far already. He'd made it through half of Fernbrook district, where plenty of elves would love to see him dead. He had also slipped by that terrible Hell-Touched, with the help of the roughest-looking crow he'd ever seen. Now he was just moments from having some kind of answer as to why this pendant was important. He could count on Dandrikan trying to cheat him in some way. Fraenk knew it was magic, but the unscrupulous dealer would likely try to tell him it wasn't. The more Dandrikan tried to downplay its worth, Fraenk knew the more value it possessed. What he really wanted to know was what its true purpose was. Why was it made? What could someone do with it if they could actually put it on? Could Dandrikan tell him? There was only one way to find out. Fraenk pulled the pendant out and let it dangle in the light, ready for Dandrikan's depreciative assessment of it as a worthless trinket. Instead, they were both surprised to see that Frank's hand was covered in a delicate layer of frost crystals. They both stared in wide-eyed amazement.
Oh, that's a cursed necklace right there.
Dandrikan gulped. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.